Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Lindquist, part of Team Manta Cares, and I want to welcome you to our Patient from Hell podcast club. The purpose of the Patient from Hell PCORI episodes, funded by the Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, is to bring PCORI-funded researchers onto the podcast to share about their research so that more of us can learn about and use the research in our own experiences. And the podcast club gives us the opportunity to chat with members of our community to get their thoughts on each episode. So today I am very excited to speak with two fantastic guests. We have with us Jeremy Patch, the Director of Patient Programs and Educations for our nonprofit partner Zero Prostate Cancer, and Eric Morrow, who is someone who has had to deal with prostate cancer personally. We're going to ask Eric about his cancer experience and also hear more from Jeremy about the great work going on at Zero Prostate Cancer. Then I'm going to get their thoughts on episode 48 of the podcast, Health Economics and Racial Disparities in Prostate Cancer Patients, with Dr. Jayadevvapa from the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, Jeremy, I would love to turn it over to you to hear a little bit more about the work you all are doing at Zero Prostate Cancer.
Sure. Thanks so much, Molly, for having us. Really appreciate it. Zero Prostate Cancer is the leading national nonprofit with the mission to end prostate cancer and help all who are impacted. We advance research, provide support, and create solutions to achieve health equity to meet the most critical needs of our community. So one of the key things we do as an organization is empower individuals in the fight against prostate cancer through advocacy at both the federal and state levels. Our advocates help raise awareness, support research funding, and advocate for policy changes. In addition, I have the great privilege of helping lead our patient support and education programs. One of our flagship programs is 0360. It's a free helpline staffed by case managers who help patients and their families navigate the complex maze of the healthcare system and insurance, find resources to help pay for treatment and living expenses, connect with emotional support services, and ensure access to care. Zero also offers multiple programs for those impacted by prostate cancer to connect to peer support to make sure no one faces this disease alone. These include nearly 160 virtual and in-person support groups, a one-to-one peer matching program called Mentor, and online support communities as well. These allow patients and their loved ones to not only get emotional support, but also a way for them to be empowered and informed about the disease to make them better advocates for themselves. Because Black men are much more likely to be diagnosed with and die from prostate cancer, Zero weaves our health equity efforts throughout all of these programs. But we also have our Black Men's Prostate Cancer Initiative that includes a Black Men's film series, dedicated support groups for Black men, and focusing on partnerships to increase awareness and education. We also know that veterans are at a higher risk of getting prostate cancer than the general population, and so we have a Veterans Initiative as well. This work is supported by our Health Equity Advisory Board and a Veterans Advisory Board. And this seems like a great segue into introducing Eric, who is a veteran himself. Eric, I'm glad to be joined with you today and for you to share your story, and grateful for your work with Zero. Eric Morrow was diagnosed in 2021 with very high-risk locally advanced prostate cancer at age 49, and he'll share more of his story in a bit. He's a husband and father with 2 teenage children, and he opted for an aggressive treatment plan that included prostatectomy and external beam radiation therapy and 2 years of androgen deprivation therapy, or ADT. He gladly completed ADT in October 2023 and remains optimistic about his long-term prognosis and the future of prostate cancer research and treatment developments. Professionally, Eric served as an Air Force officer for 20 years, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 2013. He then spent 9 years as a sales rep and executive in the medical device industry before leaving that position in 2023 to devote more time to family and prostate cancer advocacy efforts. Eric is a Zero Prostate Cancer champion and mentor, as well as a consumer reviewer with the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program's Prostate Cancer Research Program. He also volunteers as a patient advocate with the Center for Prostate Disease Research at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda. He currently works from home in Bowie, Maryland. Eric, we're looking forward to hearing your story.
Thanks.
Eric, thank you for your service, first of all. You are doing so many amazing things, and we would love to hear kind of in your words, what did prostate cancer look like for you? How did you first get your diagnosis, and what's life like now?
Sure, Molly. So I guess I first started talking to my primary care provider about prostate cancer screening probably in around 2016, after I learned that my father had been diagnosed a few years earlier. He and I aren't particularly close, and so it took a little while for me to learn about his diagnosis. But once I did, I started talking to my doctor. I knew that PSA tests were the way to determine whether or not you were at higher risk and needed additional testing for prostate cancer. But beyond that, I really didn't know a whole lot. As you know, I think like a lot of men here in the U.S., I assumed it was something that older men got, and it wasn't really necessarily super applicable at my age, and so I didn't do a lot of research. And because the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force had changed the guidelines for prostate cancer screening, or for PSA screening, from age 40 to age 55 back in 2012, my primary care provider told me, "Oh, you don't need to worry about it. You're too young." And even when I mentioned my family history, she kept telling me, "Nope, you don't need it. You're too young, not until at least age 50. But during those intervening years, one of the things that happened is, again, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force changed the guidelines for colonoscopies, and they revised it downward from age 50 to age 45. And when I went in for my physical at age 49, my doctor told me, again, don't worry about PSA screening. You don't need it yet, but you are, you're now in the window for a colonoscopy. And so I scheduled my colonoscopy. I went in for it. When I woke up, the doctor basically said, "Colon looks great. Your prostate's a little enlarged. You might want to see a urologist about that." And we were in the middle of COVID. I was working insane hours. It seemed, I guess, important, but not critical. And I'll be honest, it kind of fell off of my to-do list for a little while. And so the GI doc called me back a month later and said, "Hey, I just wanted to check and see if you made your urology appointment." And, knowing what I know now, that doctor probably saved my life. So I scheduled my urology appointment. Like a lot of specialties, it took a little while to get in. I saw the urologist, and initially he was a little skeptical and sort of went, "Well, I don't know what the GI guy knows about prostates." But, I explained family history, and he was like, "Well, we can do a DRE, a digital rectal exam, and a PSA test, and that'll tell us more." So he did the DRE, felt something unusual, sort of said, "It could be nothing. We'll know more after the PSA test." I went down to the lab, gave my blood, and I got a call several hours later that same day from the doctor, and he said, "I need you to come in for a biopsy next week. At your age, under 50, really anything over a 4 PSA wise, and we start to become concerned, your PSA is 225. Yeah. So I did the biopsy the following week, and the week after that, I got the results back and learned that I had, Gleason 9 prostate cancer. I'll be honest, I didn't understand much when I first saw the report, because I actually went online after hours to check my results, and it had come in probably at about 1800 or at about 6 p.m. So it was after the doctor had gone home for the evening. But all I saw was prostate adenocarcinoma. I printed out the results, gave them to my wife, and she was like, "What does this mean?" I said, "I think I have prostate cancer." And that was sort of the beginning of our saga.
Wow, that's intense, Eric. Jeez. So, when in your process did you connect with Zero Prostate Cancer? What sort of support? Clearly, it sounds like your wife was there on your journey with you, but kind of where did you look to for information? And as you get this news that just derails life as we
Sure.
know it.
Right. So initially, the urologist I saw, when we met with him, he basically said, you can either do surgery or you can do radiation. 5-year survival statistics for both are about the same for localized cancer. And at that point, we didn't know much beyond the fact that it was localized and it had not metastasized to any distant parts of my body yet. But I guess he gave me a lot of information, but didn't necessarily provide any recommendations, and that's kind of what I was looking for. So I asked for a second opinion, and fortunately, here in the DC area, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center is the cancer center of excellence for the Department of Defense. So the Murtha Cancer Center, named for former Congressman John Murtha, deals with all different types of cancer, and within that is the Center for Prostate Disease Research. So he forwarded my case over there. They asked for a few additional scans, and I got word back that my cancer had spread into my pelvic lymph nodes.
Wow.
So when I went to meet with the doctors there, I was, again, extremely fortunate. They run what's called a multidisciplinary clinic. And so during that, it's an all-day session for new prostate cancer patients, or I guess new localized prostate cancer patients. And during that multidisciplinary clinic, you meet with a nurse educator, a dietitian, genetics counselor, social worker, pelvic floor therapist, urologic oncologist, radiation oncologist, clinical researchers, and sexual health urologist also. So they kind of throw everything at you that one day. You have a chance to talk to all of the specialists separately, and then you go to lunch, and they sit down and they talk about your case and jointly kind of come up with their recommendation for best treatment. So when I came back from lunch, my wife and I sat down, and both the urologic oncologist and radiation oncologist came into the room and said, "Look, you're young, you're otherwise healthy, you have very aggressive cancer. We want to get very aggressive back at it. And so, this is it's not a common treatment path, but what we want to try and do is deliver kind of the maximum blow that we can to your cancer. And so we're recommending a radical prostatectomy. And then once you recover from that, we're going to start you on androgen deprivation therapy. And after a couple of months of ADT to weaken those cells, we're then going to do 39 sessions of external beam radiation therapy." And so that's what we did. So I had surgery on July 19th of 2021. I had radiation therapy basically the months of January and February of 2022. And I was on androgen deprivation therapy from the end of October 2021 until the end of October 2023.
Wow. My goodness.
So
how are you feeling today? Are you feeling good? Quality of life is good?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of the expected side effects from prostatectomy. It turned out that in addition to having pelvic lymph node invasion, I also had an extra prostatic extension and perineural invasion. So I had partial nerve sparing surgery. And so, I have continuing ED, I have continuing incontinence. Both of those are manageable, and the EDs to a large extent treatable. Um, but the biggest thing for me, when I was sitting in that first doctor's office and he was telling me 5-year survival statistics, at the time I had an 18-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I was like, I don't want 5-year survival statistics. I want 20-year survival statistics. And so I am more than happy to be living with the side effects I have because I'm still living.
Totally.
My urologic oncologist basically said, if you hadn't had that colonoscopy when you did, and if you'd waited another year to get a PSA check and come to see me, you likely would have had, low to mid volume metastatic bone disease, and we'd be in a very different place.
Right. Wow. That's amazing, Eric. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm curious, Jeremy, because clearly, at Zero Prostate, you have all of these services that are helping kind of support patients. And Eric, it seems to me in terms of kind of the multidisciplinary, attack plan, and the fact that you right away knew to get a second opinion, I feel like you fall very cleanly, and we call them our patients from hell, hence the podcast, of people that, are empowered, engaged, can go advocate for themselves. But I imagine, Jeremy, from your perspective, and Eric, some of the kind of immediate emotions that you had upon hearing your diagnosis is, oh my gosh, like, I want to live, this is terrifying. Jeremy, when you talk with people, or when, Zero Prostate talks with people who, might not necessarily even know to ask for a second opinion, or, really don't, know the questions to ask, how do you see those processes? What do you all do to kind of help in that shared decision making? Because again, I'm transitioning a little into kind of the topics of the podcast, but the idea of shared decision making and really being armed with the right questions to ask, and the ability to not only take what the clinical guidelines are, which Eric, for you weren't super clear anyway, but then also to layer on your preferences, your life circumstances. What do you see, Jeremy, for kind of a typical patient you would speak with at Zero Prostate in terms of how they navigate that process?
Yeah, I think a lot of patients come to us, when they've just heard those words and they just go online and are looking for information, and they might stumble across us if they're lucky enough to, hear about us from their doctor. That would be ideal, right? But that doesn't always happen. But I think a lot of patients are shocked and don't know what questions to ask. And particularly, maybe that because Eric was younger when he was diagnosed, but a lot of men are over 65 when they're diagnosed. We are trying to fight the stigma that it is just an older man's disease, but most men are over 65. And I think to some extent there may be a generational, we don't question the doctor kind of attitude as well. And I've learned that from my parents, working with them. I think we try to, through our, just help promote our programs, and with people like Eric's help, who is a mentor, so he's available. What that program is, we mostly have newly diagnosed patients. Maybe they're patients with a recurrence, and they're kind of newly stepping into this after, not thinking about it for a while. But most are newly diagnosed, and they're coming and they just have questions. They want to talk to somebody who's been through it, maybe has the similar risk level that they had, or considering, or has gone through the same treatments that they might be considering. Programs like that help empower them, right, to give them the questions to ask their doctor. We have documents a series called Questions to Ask Your Doctor, actually, on if you're newly diagnosed, if you have advanced disease for certain things like clinical trials, chemotherapy, that type of thing. So we've built that series out over the last couple of years. So we really just truly are trying to empower patients and make sure that they do know they can get a second opinion and should feel comfortable getting a second opinion, that it may be a red flag if their doctor finds that is defensive when that comes up, or discourages it, that might not be the right doctor for you. So we want people to definitely feel comfortable with their provider. And not only, certainly in the early stage, Eric is unusual in that he had like the kitchen sink thrown at him. I think you even said that, maybe, Eric, but you use that term. But he had radiation and surgery and ADT, and because his disease was so aggressive, most men are not going to have that as aggressive as disease, and are probably going to be weighing if they're early stage, localized, if they're fortunate enough and it's very low risk or low risk, can I consider active surveillance and forego treatment? And that would be ideal. But if there are medium risk, or what we call, I guess, intermediate risk, then they might be looking at, okay, I probably need surgery or radiation. Those are the top two choices generally. And so we like to encourage people to talk to a urologist, which is where most men start, but also consider talking to a radiation oncologist to get their perspective. And if you can, even a medical oncologist who can kind of take it all in and guide you and maybe help you make decisions between the two options. So we just really try to inform patients of what their options are and help them to be empowered to ask the right questions.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think the biggest kind of statement I get in talking with patients is you get dropped into cancer land and you don't know what you don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is like a whole new world. Often it's a new language. So the fact that, you all are there to provide some sense of orientation and, again, those questions to ask and even just a semblance of what to expect is so incredibly helpful. I think next I'll just ask both of you, kind of in terms of the podcast, if there was anything, that jumped out that resonated with you, or that you were like, this is, totally contrary to what I've experienced. I'd love to just hear any kind of nuggets that really stood out to either of you. And maybe Jeremy, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciated Dr. Jayadevvapa's research, his summary of his research, and particularly the light that he was kind of bringing to prostate cancer and issues of quality care, value, and health disparities and health equity. I noted a couple of things, kind of his discussion of overuse of low value care and underuse of high value care. And one thing I wanted to point out was he talked about men over the age of 70 getting PSA tests as an example of overuse of low value care. And I just kind of want to connect this back to even Eric's story when talking about the United States Preventive Services Task Force guidelines, and how in 2012 they kind of took a huge step back and were really concerned about over treatment and over testing of with the PSA test in men, and then in 2018 revised it to recommend for men between the ages of 55 and 69. But I think I just want to shine a light on how there is an agreement and there's not consensus around this. It has been in debate now for 12 years, and even probably before those recommendations came about. And we totally understand the overtreatment piece of it. But what we've seen is the cases of advanced stage prostate cancer rise over the past few years. And we believe that this is probably due to men taking a step back, and even their doctors taking a step back and not recommending or not having discussions with men about testing and prostate cancer and what their personal risk factors might be. So we just want to continue to reiterate the conversation about shared decision making and talking with your doctors about what's right for you based on your own personal risk factors, your lifestyle, and what's important to you. And then also just obviously knowing your options, what they are if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer. So I think it did kind of shine a light on that continued controversy. So I just wanted to highlight that. I don't know if, Eric has any thoughts.
Yeah, I'll reiterate what Jeremy said. Basically, 1 out of 8 American men will develop prostate cancer at some point in their lifetime. For African American men, like myself, that rate goes up to 1 in 6. And we're also more likely to both develop more aggressive cancers and to die from prostate cancer. So screening and early screening and detection is critical, especially for high-risk men. That's African American men, men with a family history, and veterans. There's some research out that shows that veterans actually have a 1 in 5 chance of developing prostate cancer at some point in their life. And we're at a point now where the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs recognizes prostate cancer as a service-connected illness for men who served in Vietnam and were potentially exposed to Agent Orange, as well as for men that were deployed to the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and Afghanistan and Central Asia for the global war on terror, and were potentially exposed to burn pits and other toxins.
Right.
So, for all of those groups, I'm not a doctor. I don't have, the research in hand that shows what the difference would be if you started testing younger. But certainly for those groups, I would love to go back to start getting your PSA checked at age 40. And it's important for both, doctors already know this, but it's important for patients specifically to understand that a high PSA does not necessarily mean you have prostate cancer or you need surgery. It means that there's some further discussion and maybe some further imaging required to come up with a recommendation for whether or not even to biopsy. So the PSA test is a relatively inexpensive blood test. It is, in terms of diagnostic testing, it's extremely non-invasive. So there's the cost to the system is not very high if you start screening at an early age. What it requires is a lot more education for general practitioners so that they can understand and interpret those PSA results and have an informed conversation with their patients to determine what, if any, next steps are required.
Yeah. Well said, Eric. I think that is the perfect note to end our podcast club conversation on. Thank you both so much for being a part of this, for sharing your story, Eric, Jeremy, for sharing the great work at Zero Prostate Cancer. We'll link to Zero Prostate's website in this podcast club video. And again, really appreciate both of your thoughts and opinions today. It will definitely help create some more patients from hell. So we're always here to educate and empower. So thank you both for being a part of this.
Thank you, Molly.
This podcast, show notes, and newsletter is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or any materials linked from this blog is at the user's own risk. The content here is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.